Tuesday Open House has been in existence since 1995, and today we're going to talk about the history of the church. But first, we will have a couple announcements. As you know, the last two sessions in January had to be moved to virtual. However, we have planned, and it should be announced in the communicator, that the February meetings will be in the sanctuary, not in the fellowship hall. They will be in the sanctuary, and we will serve bag lunches at the end. We will not have coffee, it's my understanding. So this will be announced in the communicator, but it was an agreement because we do have in-church services, so we should be able to have Tuesday Open House in the sanctuary. Still will be masks required. And so I'd like to welcome you all today, who all has joined us on the virtual program. And today we really are fortunate because we are looking at the 100 years of Mindekirken through the eyes of a person who's a great historian. And she is going to have a wonderful story for us. Gracia Grindal has been a longtime member of the church, also a former professor at Lutheran Seminary, and many other things she has as talents, and we'll not go over them, but you'll see a lot of them in her presentation, see and hear a lot of them. So please welcome Gracia Grindal to our program.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? You're here?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. You come through. Thank you.
Marilyn asked me to have devotions, and I'm going to use the text that Hans G. Stubb, the president of the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America, NLCA, used when the basement was dedicated in 26, Psalm 84. It's very appropriate. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul longs, yes, faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and flesh sing for joy to the living God. Even the sparrow finds a home, and the swallow a nest for herself, where she may lay her young. At your altars, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God. Blessed are those who dwell in your house, ever singing your praise. Selah. Here ends the reading. That's so appropriate. These people had been looking for a place to worship, and they finally got the basement built. And so as Stubb preached about the sparrow finding a home and the swallow a nest, it was so appropriate for these young people who had worked so hard for this basement. And then the last, blessed are those who dwell in your house, ever singing your praise. It was a blessing to all those who would be in the congregation forever. And so I take it as a blessing for us today as we talk about the history of the church. Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank and praise you for this great word from your word in the Psalms. We thank you that you have given us a home where we may sing your praise. And we thank you for being our dwelling place. Now bless and keep us as we hear these words about history. Make me clear and my audience understanding and helpful. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. We're going to do in this history now, we're going to do the history of Mindekirken up until 1933. And then next week, we'll do the history of Rasmussen, who came in 33 and left in 58. So I want to start with this picture here and move to where the church congregation really started. The Bethlehem's Young People's Society, Ungdomsforening, was meeting from about 1905 until 1923. And they were speaking in Norwegian, and they were having prayer meetings, Bible studies, singing. Music was very important to them. They had a string band and a choir, and they bought a piano very early. So they were very interested in music as well. And these four people are fundamental in the Young People's Society: Petrina Thorsen, Sverre Dahlen, Christian Brodal, and Laura Eng. I can't find a picture of her. Petrina Thorsen was not young, but typically in these Young People's Societies, the people just stayed. She was about 50, 60 at this time. So but here are the eras in our history: the founding with the Norwegian American pastors, Andreas Holteng, and then the building of the church with Christian Munson, and then the growing and the changing and the beginning of English services, and then pastors from Norway, which we'll talk about through the year. As I said, there was a burgeoning population of Norwegians, young people, in Minneapolis, in this area, because it was kind of the South Minneapolis was kind of the Norwegian center of the city. And this Bethlehem's Young People's Society had started in 1906. It was very active in 1915. It was on, Bethlehem was on 14th and 18th. It then moved to its place on 41st and Lindale. And the Young People's Society saw that the direction of the churches, especially Bethlehem, was to get rid of Norwegian. And just to show you what the neighborhood looks like, here you can see, here's Franklin, here's Bethany, but these are where the mother churches of many of these synods belong. Here's St. Paul's, that was in the area for a long time from 1872, the Hauge Mother Church. And then here you have Trinity, the mother of Augsburg, and the Free Church. Bethlehem was very big in the United Church, and here is Our Savior is big in the Norwegian Synod, and Ebenezer big for the Lutheran Brethren. So all of the mother churches are here in this area, and Augustana was the mother church of them all. And that's, now where the church is still there, but it's been sold to a young what's it called? Hope Church. Anyway, the most important thing in the 1915 to 1920 era for Norwegian Lutherans was that the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America was founded, which became the ELC. It was founded on June 9th, 1917, and it had Norwegian in its name. It combined all three major strains of Norwegian Lutherans: Hauge Synod, the United Church, which is the Augsburg St. Olaf group, and then the Norwegian Synod, which was centered at Luther College. When they had that merger, it was one of the most exciting things for Norwegians in the whole country, because now at last the Norwegians had come together. There was a procession from St. Paul Armory to St. Paul Auditorium, led by mounted police. There were flag bearers, Hauge Synod, Norwegian Synod, United. Pastors and professors marched with lay people 8 abreast. 8,000 people waited the procession, and a choir of 1,500 to 1,800 with a Luther band. It was something else. And they were all so delighted that the Norwegians now were one, except for the Free Church and the Lutheran Brethren, who'd been asked but chose not to come along. So this huge celebration of Norwegian Lutheranism in America was done by people who were fluent in Norwegian and English. They were moving toward English. Stubb, the president, he was born at Muskego in 1849, and he'd been a leader in the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America from almost his childhood. And he moved toward having the minutes and meetings in both English and Norwegian. And that was a move to be progressive. He wanted to move the church into English so that it could maintain its place among the young people. But Norwegian, even though their name was Norwegian Lutheran Church in America, Norwegian could not be the language, even if it was in the name. Stubb moved to change the name from Norwegian to something like United Church, and he was greeted with horror. Even though it passed in the assembly, it was greeted by great opposition out in the churches. even though there was a strong pressure to speak English, so the church would have a future. A group of pastors formed to press for English, and they met at University Lutheran Church of Hope in November 1917. Stubb was shocked at the reaction to his proposal to change the name. And there were several seminary professors who were really against changing the name. There also was, remember the World War started in April 1917, and there was a great push to get people not to speak German or any other foreign language because it was considered possibly troubling, or you could have traitors there. So William Harding of Iowa wrote they called it the Babel Proclamation on May 23rd, 1917. No foreign languages were to be spoken. We were to be 100% American, which put all Midwestern Lutherans in a quandary because the Swedes were still speaking Swedish, Germans, German, Norwegians. But he said there was freedom of speech only in English. If there's disagreement, let the authorities rule rather than the citizens. We needed a unity of purpose for the war, and everything had to be in English. Even those who couldn't understand English could not meet publicly. They had to have private services if they did. This created a reign of fear among the people. What can we do with our tradition and our language? Because the church was really speaking Norwegian still. If you look at the problems, they knew their future was English, and they now had this pressure to be 100% American, and Harding's proclamation didn't help. It was lifted in December 4th after the war ended. So they had this strong Norwegian tradition. Their religious materials, catechism and Bible and devotional materials were all in Norwegian. It was the language of the heart, of the faith. And there was a rich literary movement of Norwegian American literature, history, books of all kind. And Rolvag of St. Olaf and Waldemar Auger of Eau Claire pushed to keep Norwegian as the language of the heart. They knew that they had to speak English, but they thought that worship and the language of the heart should be Norwegian still. Here you can see in 1917, when the church began, 75% of churches were still speaking Norwegian. And by 1924, 50% were, and it kept going down. But that's a considerable number that were still speaking Norwegian. And if you go and look at the announcements for churches in the cities in 15 through 25, there will be 12 or 13 congregations that stress they're still having Norwegian services in the area. Trinity did, St. Paul's did. The highest population of Norwegians in America was 2 million in 1920. That there were 100 million citizens, and 2% of them were Norwegians. Here's how it worked out. I don't know how they found 12 in the 6th generation, but Norley was good at that. So there's huge 3rd generation, nearly 1 million. 1st and 2nd were Norwegian speakers, almost surely, almost 1 million. So this conflict between moving to English and keeping Norwegian for the language of the heart really was boiling around 1921-22 more strongly than it had been even in 1917-18. So the Southern District, Minnesota District of the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America, at its annual meeting in Montevideo, Our Saviors, passed a resolution from the Intermission Committee that there would be a Norwegian-speaking congregation formed to serve the Norwegian-speaking immigrants in Minneapolis. And Carl Eastfold, who had been president of the Hauge Synod, was now president of the district, and he urged this, and he had urged it for a long time. And so 1921, 1922, there was this press to begin forming the congregation. Even though the leaders knew, and everybody knew, that Norwegian would fade, there were still those who spoke Norwegian exclusively. And as they were making this proposal, it was really as a mission to these young people in the neighborhood that they were talking about, because this ungdomsforening, which the young people I talked about at the beginning, they were very insistent on remaining Norwegian speaking exclusively. So this was a mission field for this Hageman Eastfold, but he also began to think of it as a memorial to the immigrants. Now, the pastor at Bethlehem and then St. Paul's was C.K. Solberg, and he was an aggressive Anglicizer, and he opposed this talk of a congregation. This is Dick Solberg, and his son was David Soul on Harsky and Starsky and Hutch. And so Solberg was adamantly against this idea. And Eastfold suggested that maybe the two congregations, Bethlehem and St. Paul, should meet with the youth and decide which congregation would keep Norwegian as its exclusive language. And this is what's interesting about this. It's the young people who want this to be exclusively in Norwegian. But the idea that the youth then would join the congregation that chose to speak Norwegian didn't go over well. Solberg said it would be desirable if the group found another church to rent in another neighborhood. Clearly, he viewed it as a threat to his congregation, St. Paul's, and his old congregation, Bethlehem. So this Young People's Society had included, you can read in the minutes, Sverre Dahlen, John Dahlen's father, Laura Eng, who was a great aunt of John Dahlen, Katrina Thorson, who was the great aunt of John Pedersen, and Christian Brodal, who owned Brodal's Cafe on Cedar that was still going strong in the 40s. My parents went there for lunch all the time. This group wanted Norwegian spoken exclusively. And later, just after Mindekirken started, many of them were beginning to move over to Mindekirken. And when Mindekirken started Young People's Society in 23, the Young People's Society of Bethlehem moved to Mindekirken's Young People's Society, and they became leaders of the congregation. The most serious question, as I said, which was boiling, was the language of the heart, faith, and the home. Ole Rolvag argued for keeping the cultural heritage and teaching the next generation so young Norwegian Americans could appreciate their cultural heritage. Many people call this the divided heart. Dorothy Burton Skordal has a book on that, on immigrant literature from the Nordic countries. And Rolvag wrote a book, Omkring Fedrearven, concerning our heritage, which was about this very question. Now, the distress of the church leaders is clear in the fall of 1921, as this idea was gaining some following. The leaders of this group were summoned to explain themselves to the district mission committee, which was very much opposed to this. And one of the people was J.C.K. Preuss. He wanted to know what was going on. The pastors in the Minneapolis area had to approve it, they decided. And then Stubb would meet with Eastfold and others in the West Hotel to discuss the idea in November of 1921. That was a fabulous hotel in the late 19th century. It became decrepit over time. They had to tear it down. Now, the Young People's Society was watching all this, and they had become disenchanted with Bethlehem, as I said, and Katrina Thorson began arguing for them to join Mindekirken's Young People's Society at a meeting in Dania Hall, the much lamented Dania Hall. And over time, some 300 members of this Young People's Society moved to Mindekirken because of her work. So on January 3rd, 1922, at Central Lutheran, J.A.O. Stubb, the son of President H.G. Stubb, was aggressively American and English speaking. He was meeting with this group, and they agreed to have an organizational meeting at Golgotha Lutheran Church at Pleasant and Lake. Stubb wanted there to be this church so they could go on with the English in all of the Norwegian Lutheran churches in America. And if people complained about it, they'd say, go to Mindekirken. I think that's what he was thinking. So exactly 100 years ago, January 9th, 1922, they met in Golgotha Church, which you can still see. It's now a liberal Catholic church. And O. Risvold led the meeting, and it was reported on in the Lutheran Herald that in all 22 members had joined and several others had expressed their intention of joining. So they formed a committee to draft a constitution, and that it began. So that's where we date our birthday. So they went the next month, February 7th, 22, they went to the Hauge Church, St. Paul's, which was in Seven Corners at the time. And they had their first official meeting there. They had their first service and official business meeting. They took the name, the Norske Lutherske Menighet i Minneapolis, the Norwegian Lutheran Congregation in Minneapolis. And here is the inside of the church where they met. And they sang, I Jesu navn skal all vår gjerning skje, in Jesus' name shall all our work be done, which is the theme of the centennial. Now, Bethlehem and St. Paul's were neighbors, but they had very different views on some things. Bethlehem had been formed by members from Trinity who had left because of the Augsburg fight in the 1890s, and they were ready to move to Lindale on 41st. So they needed this young group of Norwegian Americans who wanted to have an exclusively Norwegian church. This, as we've talked about, they needed a place to meet. So they met sometimes at Bethlehem, and they met also at St. Paul's and other places. They needed a place. I've talked about this cultural heritage, and I think it was strongest in 22, saving it. Waldemar Auger of Eau Claire was very big on this, and the parochial schools were the vehicle, they thought, to keep Norwegian, at least for the language of the heart. And as I said, Ole Rolvag also. Now, there were big fights about this in the church. Munson, who became the first interim pastor at Mindekirken, gathered with 2,500 youth near Rothsay to hear Rolvag and Auger and in running argue for the Norwegian language and tradition. And the Mindekirken Ungdoms, what became the Ungdom Society, had delegates there. On the other hand, later that month, 20,000 Lutherleaguers in La Crosse heard Governor J.A.O. Price say English was necessary, and the Roosevelts had said that they had to leave the Dutch Reformed Church because the language never changed. So to these 20,000 in 22, just after Mindekirken was founded, J.A.O. Price said, I want to sound a note of warning to you people. If you are not going to lose your solidarity with the Lutheran Church and have your boys and girls driven away from you, you will have to satisfy yourself that this is not a Norwegian church, but an American church in the United States. This was very strong. And his uncle, J.C.K., had been against, or his brother, J.C.K., had been against the founding of the church too. So the first pastor to serve was M.O. Wee, who was professor at Hauge Synod Seminary. And then in 1917, when the seminaries merged, he was at Luther Seminary, and he represented the Hauge tradition very strongly. And he agreed to serve as interim until a pastor could be called. And there were other seminary profs who were for keeping Norwegian. R.O. Brandt, I think, and a couple others. And the Stubbs were very upset about the seminary profs. Finally, as the church congregation was meeting around Seven Corners area in the Phillips neighborhood, they called A.J. Hulteng, who was from the Cultural Heritage Party. He had made a speech in 1918 against Stubbs' change of the name from the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America. And he said that the Norwegian language would grow. But he came from Grand Forks and he was old. He tried to resign several times. He said he was too old. The congregation did not accept his resignation because they loved him. But he just couldn't handle all of the arranging and all of the work it took. They had to find a place to meet. They had to try to find a way to raise money to build a church. It was really difficult for him. When he left, he made a speech in which he named the difficulties. He said, "This is a congregation of the young and the very old. I have no baptisms. The young hadn't married yet and were having children. They had no weddings. He had a couple of funerals, and there were no children in the Sunday school, but there was a very active youth program." So he left really exhausted. And then they had to trouble finding a pastor, and that was a big lot of work. They had to have interim pastors, and I won't go through those interims, but there were several who came and served between Hultang and Munson. But there were two young women, or younger women, Katrina Thorson and Laura Eng, who served as very important stakes, pillars of strength for the congregation. Katrina Thorson, and she was asked to be a deaconess for the congregation, but she said no because the congregation couldn't afford her. But she was on every board, youth and the congregation. So you can see this youth, these people from the youth society came in and became leaders of the congregation. Laura Eng was called in 1927 as a congregation's deaconess and was called Sister Laura for the rest of her life. She visited thousands of people in the area, newcomers sick. She made about 150 visits per month. And she helped collect money for the building fund along with Katrina Thorson. And later, which I'll talk about next time, she worked with Elias Rasmussen to retire the debt. So these two women, strong women, were very important to the survival of the congregation. Now, as they were talking about building, and 1925 came along, the language turned to having a memorial church. And Eastfold was chair of the Stavanger Ramslag, and he was urging them to support the church. And they finally agreed to, and most of you know that the logs in the churches were not quite, they were different, cross purposes in some sense. But the log said, okay, they'd had several conditions. They would name the church Stavanger Ramslag Memorial, Norske Lutherske Menighet i Minneapolis. And the log would have an office in the church, but the church would be the owner. And the Stavanger log would have the freedom to use the church whenever. And this was done just before the centennial of Norwegian immigration was celebrated in 25. And that language about remembering and memorializing the past became very strong. This was accepted by the congregation, but it really never developed for some reason. I can't find in the minutes any of that development. So the congregation is casting about for places to meet, and they aren't getting the support from the log that they thought they would. They first met at Bethlehem and then at St. Paul's, which was on 15th Avenue and 4th, and then Riverside Chapel. Some of you have seen this building on Riverside. And they finally found a place, Franklin Hall on 17th and Franklin. And that's really where they met until they got the basement finished. Even in 1923, they established a building fund. And to do that, they had to do many legal things. They first tried to rent or buy Holy Trinity Lutheran at 29th and 29th. That was for sale. That didn't work. And then the Swedish Temple, which is where the Covenant Church is now, but that cost $25,000 and they couldn't raise that. Then Bethlehem wanted $35,000 for their church, and they wanted it now. And I think Bethlehem made it difficult for this congregation. so that this young people's congregation could not afford it, since it was mostly young people with not enough money. And so that collapsed, and St. Paul's bought Bethlehem. Now they're meeting at Franklin Hall on 15th. And in 1926, where they were meeting, they finally called a pastor, Christian Munson. And think about this. There were regularly 500 in church 3 times on Sunday, 2 in the morning and 1 evening service. And Munson was a fine preacher and evangelical pastor. He came from Kristiansand. This is his family. His father was a carpenter, and his brother was a famous organist who would premiere the organ in Mindekirken at a concert. Munson was about 50-some when he came. He came from Trinity in Brooklyn. That's a real strong connection for Mindekirken. His father was a carpenter, and Trinity was founded by Southern Norwegian immigrants who were affected by the revivals at the time in Norway. And Munson was a Sunday school superintendent there for 5 years. And then he was city missionary in Chicago, 1912, 1913. He attended Lutheran seminary for a year and was a pastor in Harding, Iowa, Norway, Iowa. And he came to Mindekirken in April 15th, 1926. And he believed in the power of prayer. A Lutheran seminary Professor Tanner said about him when he spoke about what a fine pastor he was. And prayer meetings for Christian Munson were central. At the groundbreaking for the basement in May 23rd, 1926, Eastfold broke ground, and there were places in the current basement fellowship hall now that we have for 500 to 550. I can't quite see that, except I suppose if chairs, if that's all there were, chairs, they could do that. They had Sunday school at 9:30, worship at 10:30, afternoon worship and evening, and then Thursday Bible study and prayer. And Munson was very good at that. He was a good sjælesorger. They said he was good to deal with the troubles of people as they were suffering. Now the youth group, as I've said, was the driving force for the new building, and they built this basement where the youth group met every Sunday evening. They bought chairs, and this is Kari Fossey's picture of them. I think there's one left in the congregation. $400 at 400 chairs at 500. Young people filled the fellowship hall every Sunday evening, and Laura Eng would write in the paper, 500 attendees 3 times a Sunday. It's almost unbelievable. Now, the first worship service in the basement was held November 26th, before the dedication. But Munson made sure that prayer was central, and he opened that day of celebration when they had their first service, not the dedication, with a prayer meeting that lasted an hour. There was a large choir led by E. Tollefson of Luther Seminary. The youth service was at 5, and then they had a Sånggudstjeneste, which is a hymn service, and Tanner spoke. And then Thursday they had uppbyggelse meetings, that was edifying meetings, testimony meetings, Bible study, whatever. The organist, and this shows interest in good music, Ragnar Pedersen was educated at McPhail's, I think. Piano, Gertrude Lee. The piano and chairs were given by the Ungdomsforening, and they ended it with God's Word is Our Great Heritage. Wonderful hymn by Gudvig. This is probably what the kitchen looked like. Kari remembers it like this. And it was the center of their worship and their festival times together eating. The basement was dedicated November 1926, and Stub gave the sermon on Psalm 84. And it must have been a very moving time for them. So from the time of the basement, they would have Juletrefest. They had Juletrefest from the very beginning, 3 times after Christmas Day, when they would gather and march around the Christmas tree, as Kadi remembers. They had a string band, which was very popular. You can see all these people. Sverre Dalen played the violin, was a very accomplished musician, and was a part of the choir. You can see the guitars here. And that became a popular institution to belong to, along with the choir. Now, after the basement was dedicated, after Christmas 26 in 1927, they began raising money for the sanctuary because they knew they needed that. And there were many attempts to find subscribers around the city and region. And every minute's collection in the minutes, there would be a note. Patrina Thorson came with a couple $100 from somewhere. She was indefatigable. And they did raise 20,000 and 11,000, altogether 31,000 for the building of the basement. They began to become quite serious about this, and the trustees in 1928 approved the looking for a way to build a sanctuary. Christian Bodal here became the chair of the building committee, and he was very significant in this work. He must have been doing quite well in the cafe, Brodal's Cafe, because he made sure that the altar painting, he and his wife gave the altar painting. So in 1928, there was a committee that wanted to help with this. And the committee was not from Mindekirken, but it was for Mindekirken. And Gisle Botner was a professor of Scandinavian at the university. He'd been a Luther College professor and came from very Luther College tradition. His wife was a Brandt, the daughter of Niels and Dicka Brandt. And they came together at a big, very fancy meeting in the Fellowship Hall in April 1928 with presidents of the colleges and the seminary and church presidents with famous women. And they gathered with the purpose of raising 75,000 by September. That's over the summer. And it was to be for a memorial church. Some people talked about it being a cathedral for Norwegians like Westminster Abbey, a memorial to the pioneers with archives and displays of their work, recordings of their voices, and so forth. And it would be a museum when people no longer spoke Norwegian. This was in the Minneapolis Tribune, pictures of the women who were part of this committee. And it was very well publicized. And this picture appeared of this church that would hold 1,000. You can see it's much bigger than what we have here. It was going to be a cathedral. But what happened to it, I can't find out. It didn't make any money, basically, in the summer. They went to the logs, and the logs would give them en liten sum, a little thing like $100 or $33. But in September, the congregation met and changed its name to Norwegian Lutheran Memorial Church. And instead of this collection, the trustees authorized the church to sell bonds. And they wanted not to start until they had all the money. And once again, they were enjoying the kitchen. They got enough money to start, they thought, and they laid the cornerstone on August 29th, 1929. 2,000 people came, they think. It was huge. They were still quite optimistic, but the stock market would crash in October. But still, they went ahead. Everything was done by March 1930. The windows were done by the end of the year. It was a beautiful edifice, but it created burden for the congregation. It was just like this when the church started on May 1st, when they dedicated, but they met in March 16th for their first service there. The stained glass cost $6,000. The altar was carved by Leif Melgaard, and the altar painting was a copy of the Molde altar painting. This is a very famous picture. was given by Christian Bodal and his wife, who remembered the painting from their childhood. Dedication on May 4th brought in all the big mucky mucks. Stubb is here. He's now an old man. Governor Christensen, Munson. Here's C.K. Solberg and Vislof from Norway. Big crowd and a very exciting time. They had 4 services that day. Ted Christensen, the governor, spoke Norwegian. There were other church dignitaries, Osgard, Stubb, Vislof, and there was an organ recital of the new organ. Well, after that wonderful time, the crushing debt needed to be addressed. And it was still young, mostly young people, and the depression really began to bite. 1930, 1931. Congregation took over a spiritual magazine from Duluth, hoping that subscriptions would help them raise money, called them Familiebladet, which ended up in Brooklyn. And they were worshiping here, having a wonderful time, and it was full every Sunday, but they couldn't pay for it. So things got worse and worse. And in 1933, after the annual meeting in February, they called a special meeting, and it was to repay the bonds, to enter into agreement with the owners and holders of its outstanding bonds and notes. And the Minnesota Loan and Trust Company, which had succeeded the original company, was to extend the date of the trust deed of March 29 to March 1942, and to reduce the interest on the said bonds. I can't find a record of that meeting, but the monthly board meetings increasingly became bitter and nasty, directed toward Christian Munson. The dissension became really unpleasant. And poor Munson, he couldn't raise money, but there wasn't any money to raise. So the meetings became very difficult and unpolite. Many members began resigning, and the leadership started to quit, except for the loyal ones who expressed sadness and stayed. Petrina Thorson was appalled at the way they treated Pastor Munson. His salary had to be cut. He was getting $125 a month, and they needed to cut that. He offered holiday offerings. The pastors in the Norwegian churches would get Christmas and Easter and Pentecost offerings. He said that the offering he got the next time would go to the building fund. The congregation voted to ask him to resign, and then he resisted, and the district came in, and he wrote a letter of resignation in April 1933. And then Pastor Numedal, who was a member, began to fill in. The minutes are not clear on all that happens because they don't like to record that, but one of them is "Herefter fulgte en mindre pen ordstrid." Afterwards, there followed a less lovely argument. Munson wrote a letter that's very sad, how much he loved Mindekirken, but after the storm of the Depression, the waves of need swept through the congregation, and there was no money. Many were crushed by the Depression. Immigration was no longer there. And the last year had been difficult with suffering and need, and worse, not just personal, but the church split. And he did say, "Many were kind to me. I love Mindekirken. I've tried to do my best, but for the sake of the peace and the well-being of the church, after much prayer, I believe it is best for me to resign. But my salary, which has not been paid, must be paid as soon as possible." So Numedal advised the congregation to accept the resignation, and they were divided on that. Some people really loved Munson and others really did not. So they did pass a resolution to keep Munson until January and pay him, but 27 people resigned and their names are in the minutes, and then 25, and you have resignations from the congregation happening along in those minutes. I think he served the congregation well with his concern for the spiritual life, prayer meetings, and missionary emphasis, but he simply could not weather the storm of the Depression. I don't know if anybody could have. But it's interesting, these 4 Young People's Society members stayed. Katrina Thorson continued to raise money supporting the congregation. Sverre Dahlin was president. He could lead the congregation in devotions. Very spiritual, all of them. Christian Brodal as well. And he stayed, as did Laura Eng. So the work they did to keep the congregation going, if they hadn't done that, we wouldn't be here today. These were capable people. They could lead in devotions, came to prayer meetings, served in many offices, and were members of the choir, string band, and so forth. And so we owe them a lot. Elias Rasmussen, who came next, we'll talk about next time, but he was able to save the congregation because he was very good with money. So that's my report. Questions?
I would like to thank Gracia for such a wonderful presentation today. And I did forget at the very beginning to ask everyone to put their questions in the chat box, because Dick Lundgren will read the questions and we'll start off the question and answer period. So Dick.
Okay. Well, there's all of 2 questions in the chat box, but I can get them to show up. Oh, one. Okay. First question from Marilyn. This refers to the picture that Gracia had before she started, with a church and a couple houses. And her question was whether either of the 2 houses by the church was a parsonage.
No, the parsonage was not there. I don't think they could even think about a parsonage at the time. So the pastors lived in the neighborhood. Munson lived on 28th Street, I think it was. But they weren't parsonages.
Okay, the next question comes from Sue Erickson, and I like this one. The question is, why was it that the younger people were the driving force for the founding of the church? What the resistance from the older population, who were probably the immigrants?
Well, that's what's so interesting about this story, is that we think, as we tell these stories, that the young people were all for turning to English and that the old people were for keeping it. In this story, that's not the case. It's the Young People's Society, led by these very strong individuals, who wanted to keep Norwegian as the language of the church exclusively. In fact, they always said exclusively in Norwegian. And I think I would say maybe 2 reasons is the leaders of the church knew that they had to move to English in order to keep their members. And I understand that every immigrant group has to change its language or it has no future. If it only stays in Norwegian, it has no past. But there's also this group of people who were only able to speak Norwegian and they felt most comfortable in it. There was a large migration into this area, both from Norway and then from the countryside. And they felt most comfortable in Norwegian. And Eastwold, for example, thought of these young people as a great mission field. And if you want to do mission, you have to speak the language of that group. I think that was the driving force. As they began to work on it, the notion of memorial became part of it. But I think the lively congregation that Munson started with prayer is what attracted many of these young people, not a memorial, but a place where they could be fed and grow spiritually. Does that answer that?
Yeah, if there's more questions, they'll keep popping in here.
Yeah,
Next one from Sue Erickson. Oh, no, that's the one I just read. From from Cherry Johnson, how is it that pastors' names often used a lot of initials rather than their first name?
Well, that's an interesting story. Many people that you didn't know them by, I don't know the first name of some people. You call them M.O. or things like that. It was kind of a term of endearment to just name them by their initials. And also, I knew many pastors' wives who never called their husbands by their first name, but just by their last names. Brettheim, and to name people that way, it wasn't as they weren't informal like we were, but this was a term of endearment actually to use the initials or the last name only. It's just a tradition that we changed. And it happened in the 70s when I was at Luther College. The president told the kids that were all rebelling that they could call us by our first names when they had called us by our last names, Miss Grindal or Grindal. And he didn't ask us. I think that lost something, but this is the way they thought. This is what they did.
Okay, I was just thinking of my own immigrant ancestor. He was Ole Magnuson, and he always went by O.M., and then the farm name is the last name.
Yeah.
So it was quite common.
Yeah. It was almost universal, I think, until the 70s.
Okay, there may be more questions popping in, but I had a couple here.
Yeah.
Was there ever a fire at Mindekirken?
Not during this time that I remember. Kaya would maybe know the answer to that. I don't think there was during this time.
Okay.
I've just done to 33, 22 to 33. I can't remember a fire.
The other question, obviously you're aware of the status of the construction of Norway House now. It's coming up from the basement and there is no roof on it. So I was wondering, was there some milestone when finally the church had risen from the basement, but then eventually had the roof thrown on top?
No, it was all done in May 4th, 1933, when it was built.
Okay.
Kaya hasn't, yeah.
All right. It's a little hard in bad weather to have a service in an open basement.
Right.
Okay. Let's see. Here's some. They're coming in fast now. From Terry Parker, it says, even in Mindekirken today, Norwegians will often call someone just by their last name, even today.
Right. Right.
Oh, okay. Kaya did answer, there was a fire of the new construction in 1999 before the stucco was put on, but it was put out immediately upon discovery. Okay. Yeah, you had mentioned some Lutheran church, I don't know, it was sold and became a liberal Catholic church. I'm just curious, is that its status today? Is it still a liberal?
I don't, if you go and drive by it, it's still a liberal Catholic church, but that was Golgotha Lutheran, where the church voted, the people voted to establish Mindekirken.
Okay.
And you can go there, but you can't. I've tried to get in touch with them so I could go inside, but I can't. I don't know if they're still in meeting or what, but because of the pandemic. So.
Okay. Where is that located?
On Pleasant and Lake. Well, like 31st and Pleasant.
Okay. Oh, right. I don't, let me look here. Oh, this is a very good question. Who made the stained glass?
We'll talk about that, not next time, but the time after that. The Gaiety company did the stained glass, and they did it for 6,000, and it was done in almost 4 months. It was just unbelievable that they got this done. And they're still an active stained glass window. They do stained glass still. It's gone through several owners, but Gay-T, they say was a student of Tiffany, and he learned how to make this glass that was much more translucent than many others had done. And so he came to town and became quite successful. He did the Basilica, St. Mary in Minneapolis. He did Central Lutheran. He did many, many, many churches in the area. But ours, I think, are almost the most beautiful.
Well, I agree with that. I haven't seen them all, though.
Yeah.
Was the design original, or
Well,
are these standard stained glass themes?
well, I think what happened was they had a meeting, and I can't find that, but they had a meeting to see what they would put in. And it's interesting, it tells the story of Jesus, and it starts at the west, the front west, and goes around and ends up on the front east with the ascension and Jesus in heaven. So it tells a story going around like this. But if you look at the pictures and compare, for instance, the Annunciation to Great Annunciation pictures, the artist knew all of those conventions going back to Botticelli. And so it's that's one of the things I'll talk about in the stained glass lecture, because they're treasures that are very carefully thought through and beautifully done. So.
Okay, this may be the last one unless some more are generated. This is also probably post 1933, but you mentioned the church addition, and I'm just, is that like where the office is? And
Right. It was done in 99 and 2000. Crown Prince Håkon Magnus came to break ground for that. But that's a long ways from where we are now.
Yeah.
So
okay. All right, I'm looking, there's nothing more in chat, and I don't have any more questions, so I'll turn it back over to Marilyn Sorensen. Maybe.
Marilyn, are you there? You maybe have to unmute.
I didn't realize I was remuted. I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Gracia, for a wonderful presentation. And I know that we've all appreciated hearing the history of Mindekirken, and we'll look forward to the next part of the history, which will be about the pastors. And I also want to announce that our next meeting will be in the sanctuary at 11 o'clock. It will be in person, masks are required, and we will have a bag lunch. So I'm hoping that we will have quite a nice audience for hearing the second part of our history. And thank you, Gracia, very much for being with us today.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
You all,
Yeah.
and thank you all for participating. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.